Good morning, church. It is a joy to gather with you all. I'm excited about what we have coming up. And I just want you to know that, as Kevin said, I'm excited about what God's doing here, and there's no one else I'd rather go on this journey with. So sometimes in a sermon, they say it's helpful to have a story or an illustration to start, and sometimes I try to do that. But for sake of time today, we're just going to dive right in. As you know, we're taking a break from the Gospel of John to go through some different Psalms throughout the summer. And I was hearing that Psalm read by Kelly, and you did a great job. And this bright, imagery and upbeat music, and it's like really dark Psalm about God, where are you at? Why have you rejected us? But that's the reality of the Psalms. Tim Mackey with the Bible Project, he says this, I like this quote. He says, the book of Psalms has been designed to be the prayer book of God's people as they wait for the Messiah and his coming kingdom. And as we mentioned a little bit last week, as we introduced the Psalms capture every emotion that a human could experience. They're very raw and honest and real. They capture the highs, the celebrations, the shouts of songs and procession and just utter joy. And they also capture fear and pain and agony and lament, desperation and doubt. And it really is for us today still this prayer book as we look back to the cross and resurrection at what Christ accomplished, but also looking forward to the final time when Jesus comes back and finishes everything that he started and makes all things new. It points us constantly, the Psalms do this, constantly points us to honesty and dependence with God. Psalm 74 is called a communal lament. So there's a lot of different laments in the book of Psalms. Some of them are more from the perspective of an individual, and some of them are more communal, kind of from the nation of Israel as a representative. This representative that wrote this psalm is the Psalm of Asaph. He's one of the representatives of God's people speaking out on behalf of the covenant people of God, the nation of Israel. And so that's kind of the context for this psalm. There's three main themes we're going to look at. I'm going to give them to you up front, and then we'll dive in looking at each individual one. So first, we're going to look at the reality of evil. The reality of evil. That's verses 1 through 11. And then we'll look at the remembrance of God. That's verses 12 to 17. The remembrance of God. And then lastly, we're going to look at the response of prayer, which is verses 18 to 23. The response of the psalmist to pray. The response of prayer. So let's look at the first theme we see in verses 1 through 11, the reality of evil. So in verses 1 through 11, the psalmist is very honest about the reality of evil and brokenness in the world. So to understand a little bit about the context in which this psalm was written, which is important for us as we read scripture. So what's going on here is as a result of Israel's unfaithfulness, they had been brought into the promised land, they had a temple built, but at this point now, they had been overthrown by the Babylonian Empire. Many of them had been sent out into exile, and the temple was now destroyed. The temple that was the kind of centerpiece of Jewish life was destroyed, and it seems as if there's a few scattered remains, a few scattered remnant of people that are focusing on this, and they're lamenting about what Israel once was and now what it is and the destruction that had taken place. So you can imagine the hurt and the pain and the despair that these people in this moment are feeling. And the first thing we see in verse 1, which I love, is this honest questioning of God. Starts off right away. Why have you rejected us forever, God? Why does your anger burn against the sheep of your pasture? And I love the honesty that we see here. I love the fact that this is written directly to God, and there's absolutely no mincing of words. See, the reality is God can handle your honest and raw emotions. He's not like, oh gosh, I didn't see that one coming. I'm not sure what to do with that, right? He's not like we are, when you take it out on your loved ones or your spouse or your kids when you're having a frustrated day and they get really offended because you took something out on them. Like, that's not God. He's not petty like we are. We can be real with God about where we are, and the beauty is he meets us right there. And they cry out asking God, why have you cast us off forever? Now, clearly, God had not actually cast them off forever. This is hyperbole, right? But we can understand this. We've done this when we're upset. Okay, me and Christy just argued the other day. Every now and then, once a year, we have a little argument. That's just a joke. But we had a little argument, And one of us, I can't remember which one because we both do it all the time, but we'll use the words never or always. You always do this, or you never do this. And the other person just steps back and is like, really? Always? Like we do with our kids sometimes, like, oh, I never get to go do this, right? That's what we say, but the reality is, even though that's not actually the truth, that is describing how we actually feel in the moment. And this, for the psalmist, they are describing how they feel. Their suffering, their pain feels like it's forever. And it feels like God is nowhere to be found in the midst of it. And I love it because it just sits there and continues on. You don't see a theological correction. Well, God's always by your side, right? Like this theological, which is true, right? We're going to get to that in just a moment. But in this moment, they sit in how they feel and they're honest with God. It wasn't true from an objective standpoint. They hadn't been cast off forever, but this described their emotions. And we can learn from this that we can be honest with God. If you're upset at God, it's better to tell him than to just keep it in. God, I'm really angry at you right now. God, I don't understand what you're doing right now. God, I don't think you know what's best, really. Let's just be honest. If it was up to me and I was running the universe, I would do it this way or that way. Because if we're not honest about it, we can't move to dealing with the truths behind those feelings. So ask him why he's left you in your despair, if that's how you feel. The next thing we see the author do is to remind God of his relationship with his people. Look at it in verse 2. It says, remember your congregation, which you purchased long ago and redeemed as a tribe for your own possession. And there's this cry for God, for him to remember his people, but really this cry is more for the crier than the receiver of the cry. This cry is to remind them and to remind us that we are God's people and that he is our shepherd. And even though it feels like he's rejected us forever, that he's promised that he would lead us and that he's covenanted with us, that you purchased us, God. You brought us out from exile. Why would you bring us out from exile all the way back in Egypt to just send us back here again? And so they remind God, but really they remind themselves that they are kept by the sovereign hand of the Father. And then in verses 3 through 8, we're not going to read all of them, but they call for God to come see himself what's going on. Verse 3, they say, make your way to the perpetual ruins, to all that the enemy has destroyed in the sanctuary. So your temple, you set up, this temple was supposed to be a place where God and humanity dwelt and met together, and now it's ruined, and the enemy has set up false gods in the temple. They've desecrated it, and they say, God, you got to get down here and see what's going on. Verse 7, they set your sanctuary on fire. They utterly desecrated the dwelling place of your name. They're just calling out the brokenness and the evil that they see around them. They say the temple's been plundered. The very temple whose golden floral decorations were meant to remind the people of the Garden of Eden, where God and humanity walked in the cool of the day in intimacy. This is shattered. This is broken. And they say, look, come for yourself and see. And then they just follow that by a cry of despair and a grief, more questioning of God in verse 9. They say, there's no signs for us to see. There's no longer a prophet. And none of us knows how long this will last. Like at least in the past, sometimes we had prophets like encouraging us and telling us that there was a day coming when all things would be made new, but we don't even hear your words anymore. You just seem distant and gone. Verse 10, how long will the enemy mock? Will the foe insult your name forever? Why do you hold back your hand? Stretch out your right hand and destroy them. Like it's broken. What are you doing? Where are you at, God? What are you waiting on? There's no one to say what the future holds. They're asking God, how long do you plan to refrain from establishing justice and bringing ruin to the evil one? And I love this because almost half of this psalm is just acknowledging the reality of pain and brokenness and grief. And often, and the church has been very guilty of this, we sweep it under the rug. That's uncomfortable. We don't want to go there. We don't want to deal with that. Let's just give cliches and say, get over it. The scriptures never command us to just get over the stuff that we're dealing with and to ignore the brokenness in us, in our own hearts, or around us. And so we sit in the brokenness. There's this beautiful hinge verse in verse 12. I like the way that the ESV actually has it a little better than the way the CSB does. What happens in verse 12? He says, "Yet God, my King." We saw the reality of evil, and now we see the remembrance of God. In spite of all this, in spite of the destruction of the temple, in spite of the apparent forsakenness from God to his people, in spite of the seeming victory of the evil ones, that was the reality staring them in the face. And the psalmist says, "Yet God, my King, is from of old." God is still King. And he's still my King. And he's still at work. No matter what's staring me in the face, God, my King, is from of old. He's always been. He's always existed. He's not surprised by this. He's been here before. And then in verses 12 to 18, we won't reread it, but you heard it read. The author begins to just recount story after story, snapshots that would have called the people's mind to go back to the original creation story and back to the Exodus story. Creation, when God took disorder and chaos and dysfunction, which is what the people were sitting in, and he brought life and gave everything a purpose and a place and communed with humanity. They recount that story. And they recount the Exodus story when the people were in exile, were in bondage, were in slavery to the Egyptian people. And they are released and brought through the Red Sea and given freedom and brought to a land. And I love this. In the midst of despair, in the midst of pain and grief and lament, there is no simple cliche. There's no quick, easy fix to the pain and the suffering, but there is a declaration that God is still King. There was this perceived reality that God was not in control, but the psalmist begins, again, not sweeping the evil under the rug, but after sitting in that, he begins to speak truth to the perceived reality. I don't even know if he believed all this as he said it. I don't know if his hearers believed that God was still in charge. They've asked him where he's been, but he speaks truth to both his and his readers' emotions, truth to his pain and doubt. And he begins to be reminded to look at the bigness of God. Again, we're not minimizing the situation. God is so much bigger. Oh, man. And so he knows that he might not know what the future holds, but he knows that Yahweh, the King, has worked from old on behalf of his people for the sake of his name and for the sake of his glory, and hope begins to arise that maybe he could do it again. He reminds his readers that God is good, that he is King, and that he is still sovereign when all seems lost. Amen. This is a good reminder for us. As we find ourselves in brokenness, and maybe our life is in shambles, the dreams that we had, the places we thought we'd be by now in life, they're just not there. And we're sitting around looking at the shambles of our life. We're sitting in deep moments of suffering, maybe just as a result of sin in the world around us, or maybe as a result of our own sinful decisions. And in those moments, yes, we sit in the evil, but we glance at that and we gaze on God and his bigness and his goodness. This is why we need each other. It's exactly why we need to help us fix our eyes on him. There's no longer a prophet, no one who speaks what the future holds, but there is one who has, by the word of his mouth, spoke very life into existence. He's made dead things live before. He can do it again. He laid the foundations of the earth while the stars sang his praises. He carved out a cleft for the waters by his own hand. Every morning he commands the start of the day. He's sovereign and in control, and he reigns. Whether we feel it or not, he reigns in the midst of our seasons of loss and pain and brokenness. And this is what the psalmist wanted to remind the people of. God is in control. Don't forget. Amen. Don't forget. And now, having been encouraged by the truth of God's kingly rule, having been emboldened by the reality of God's sovereignty, they pray this ridiculous, scandalous prayer to God. It's crazy. You're going to see it in just a second. So in verse 18 and 19, we see the response of prayer. Sorry, verse 18 all the way through the end of the chapter. So the reality of evil, the remembrance of God, and the response of prayer. Verse 18 and 19, he calls out to God, asking him to look at the enemy, don't deliver us over to them. And then in verse 20, this prayer gets stupid. Look at it. He says, consider the covenant, for the dark places of the land are full of violence. They tell God to consider and remember his covenant. Now they're appealing to a covenant that God made with them. And for us to understand how scandalous this request is, we've got to understand the nation of Israel. God made a covenant with them on Mount Sinai after he redeemed them and brought them from the Egyptians. And he gives them these 10 commandments, which are kind of the central terms of the covenant. It's the terms of the relationship. Don't cheat on me and don't cheat on the rest of my bride, my covenant people. Be faithful. They say, oh yeah, God, we're all in. I do. Stand up and unite themselves to God in union with him. And 40 days later, they're cheating with God on a golden calf they fashioned with their own hands. 40 days. And they're telling God to remember the covenant? What? Bro, like, you remember the covenant. I mean, we would get this, right? If we saw this like in a marriage, right? Like a husband who cheats on his wife time and time and time again. And the wife finally is like, I'm done. I want a divorce. And the husband's like, but you promised you'd stay faithful to me. Remember the covenant we made, till death do us part? We'd be like, bro, what are you talking about? Like, you ain't been faithful at all, but this is what they do. And I love the confidence and boldness. The idea that if we really believe this, that my heart doesn't even believe many times, this idea that we can approach God, calling him to his promises on the basis of his faithfulness, not ours. Because even when we are faithless, he remains faithful. And he cannot deny himself. He can't. What a beautiful prayer. They go on, and in verse 22, they say, God, rise up. Champion your cause. Don't forget us. We're poor. We're oppressed. Please deal with our shame. We don't understand honor and shame in our culture a lot. This was a big deal. Don't leave us ashamed. Give us dignity. Give us honor. And in verse 23, the psalm honestly just ends. Sometimes the psalms end on a high note. This one doesn't really. There's no response from God. Great idea to go to God boldly, but did he respond? Did he deal with the brokenness? What's the answer to the questions, the doubting, and the pain? We've seen the honesty, the grief, and the lament of evil. We've seen the remembrance of God and his character. And we see the people respond in bold prayer, but we're left asking the question, does God actually arise? Does he get up and defend his cause? Does he show up? What does he do with the problem of evil, not only affecting the people internally in their own hearts, but also in the world around them? And here's the thing about God that we see, and this is why our hermeneutic, the way we study the scriptures, is always Jesus. Because in the face of Jesus, we see that God cares deeply about evil. He cares deeply about your suffering, your agony and pain, so much that he left heaven's throne and crawled into the mess with you. He doesn't just hear and see the brokenness. He gets up and does something about it. I mean, it's great to know that God sits with you in your suffering, but I still need a God that's powerful enough to fix it. Because I can't deal with it forever. Maybe a season, but I need some hope outside of myself. Outside of this world. God had every right to remain distant and removed, to keep his hands clean, to remain uninterested. They had broken the covenant. They are the ones that got themselves in the mess. Let themselves get themselves out of it. I'm glad God doesn't treat us like we treat a lot of each other. Though they had broken his covenant time and time again, he would not break his. And though those praying this prayer probably had no idea the measure of what they were asking, they just wanted some temporary relief, a physical restoration of this temple, and give me some land. Give us another prophet to speak the word. They had no idea what was in store. See, God's response to their prayer, God's response to this brokenness and suffering, and God's response to all brokenness and suffering is Jesus. God himself became a man in the person of Christ. Though there was no prophet to speak the words of life, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory, glory of the Father full of grace and truth. God is there. As the cry of God's people was for him to direct his steps to the ruin of the temple, to remember his holy place, Jesus directed his steps to the ruin of humanity. I mean, the destruction of the original temple, which is what the earth was created to be, a dwelling place for God and man, for heaven to meet earth. And God looks on this and comes and dwells among us. God looks on the evil, and he knows that for him to deal with the evil while also saving those of us that are caught up in it, which is everyone, it means that someone is going to have to absorb the weight of sin's curse. The death blow of evil itself, all the energy that was attacked on this temple and the people of God, Jesus will absorb all of that on himself, including the wrath of his own Father, the embarrassment and shame that we feel when we've made mistakes and we've messed up our life in shambles. Jesus takes that on for us. It was never about just a physical temple. We've seen that in the Gospel of John. I'm the temple. I'm the one that will be destroyed and raised back up. Jesus is the temple that's restored, that they were praying for. He's the place where heaven and earth meet. God and human. Does God do anything? Yes, he does. Jesus enters into the plundering on our behalf so we don't have to stay there. We had broken the covenant. This means the dwelling place of God and man was rightly broken. It means the temple was rightly and justly destroyed. But Jesus became the true temple that was plundered on our behalf. He allowed himself to be destroyed by the forces of evil and injustice. He enters into our embarrassment as he's beaten and stripped naked and spit upon. I mean, the injustices of the desecration of the temple was nothing to the desecration of God himself in the person of Jesus, but he willingly walked into that on our behalf. Jesus, the true prophet, the true temple, the true Israel, the true and perfect human, he was plundered, ruined, destroyed, and laid dead in a grave. And the forces of evil rejoice. They shout in victory, and all God's covenant people again are saying, God, you're going to rise up? Are you going to defend your name, defend your cause? And 3 days later, we find the answer to the question, how long? Because he gets back up, and Jesus is the answer to our prayers. He literally rises up out of the grave, and he puts death to death, and he stomps on the head of the serpent, puts the power of evil to an open shame, takes the embarrassment, and flips it back on them, as Colossians tells us. He gives back dignity to those who are his people. Those of us who sit in shame over either our sin or the mistakes we've made, he gives you back a place of honor and dignity in his kingdom. There's no back seats in his kingdom. There's no back door you enter in. You come in with shouts of praise and celebration because of the work of Jesus. And he deals with the source of evil, the serpent. He crushes his head and deals with it. This psalm points us to Jesus. He was made ashamed to eradicate shame. He was killed to eradicate death. Jesus deals with the problem of evil finally and completely in the cross and resurrection. And we begin to see how this psalm matters for us today. See, we may not have a physical temple that's been destroyed, right? But I think every single one of us can relate to the fears, the emotions, the doubts, the questioning that God's people were experiencing. I mean, we know what it's like to break the covenant with God. I mean, we make the bold proclamations. Yeah, we're all in, God. Whatever you say, man, we're in. 2 days later, there we are again. We feel the shame. We feel the guilt. We see our life in shambles because of the mistakes we've made. The destruction that it causes not only in our own life, but the ones we love around us. Maybe for you, it's death and suffering and loss. Maybe loss of a family member. Maybe the loss of an identity or a dream you once had. It's not always a physical loss. Sometimes it's like, I had plans and goals and dreams, and it's just gone. Shattered in ruins. Maybe it's the unexpected miscarriage that catches you by surprise. And you wonder how a good God could allow this to happen. Maybe your marriage is in ruins, and the fairy tale dream you had is destroyed. It's gone. No hope of getting it back. Maybe it's the job loss that hits you. You thought at this point you'd have your retirement set, you're good to go. Instead, you're fighting to survive, and you ask God, how long? I'm just ready to go home. Maybe it's just a daily grind to try to raise your children in the ways of Jesus, and you feel alone, and you wonder if anyone sees or cares, or if you're ever going to get it right because you mess it up, and you see your kids doing the same thing you're doing, then you put pressure on yourself. Feelings of loneliness, no one knows what I'm going through. Maybe for you, it's more communal. Maybe it's not as individual. At certain times of our life, we look around at our society and we see the way certain communities, especially of color, have been treated in our society. And we wonder, God, are you going to care? Are you going to do anything? You should allow this to happen? Will you deal with the evil of racism? Will you deal with it? The evil of God's image bearers being treated with no dignity or respect? Are you going to do anything? Maybe you see the cry of the unborn rise up to the heavens. And you wonder, does God even hear? Does he care? How do we deal with this stuff? Maybe you see war and famine and the way humanity is constantly destroying each other to gain power and control. And you say, God, are you going to do anything? Are you just going to let this go on? And in these moments, we can look to the truths found in Psalm 74 as a guide, a prayer guide for us. We can recognize the reality of evil in the world. We can lament. We don't sweep it under the rug. We recognize the fact that all creation is broken and longing to be restored. We acknowledge hurt and pain. We don't skim over it and pretend everything's okay. We do that communally. We sit with each other in our grief and in the brokenness. But even in our darkest moments, we know we're not alone because Jesus does meet us there. And he gently, by his Spirit, through the means of grace that he's given us, reminds us to remember what God has done, not only in the beginning, but also at the cross and in the resurrection of Jesus. And this causes us to respond with bold, scandalous prayers, like Hebrews 4 talks about. We can approach the throne boldly to find grace and mercy in time of need, because it's based on the work of Jesus. Can you believe that? The creator of the universe listens to you. Isn't that crazy? And it's based on the work of Jesus, so you can't mess it up. He loves you as much as he loves his own son. It's wild. And we know, as we pray and say, how long? Rise up. We know he's going to fix the mess. That's the book of Revelation. We just sang about it. And on that day, the great I am, the faithful and the true, the Lamb who was for sinners slain, is making all things new. Behold, our God will dwell with us. We can look forward to something greater. When our plans and dreams and lives are in ruins, just like the temple, it's not the end. In Christ, all that's made new. And all brokenness. I don't understand how all this works. It's crazy. But all brokenness, both in our own hearts and around us, will not only be eradicated in the final kingdom. Somehow, in the here and now, it actually works about to bring a greater glory in the final kingdom. He takes the efforts of sin and brokenness and flips them on its head, just like he did in the cross. And it gives maximum glory to the Father. And all that glory will cause us to say that these afflictions were light and momentary. That's not to skim over. It's just a comparison to that. Let's lament as we recognize the reality of evil. But let's remember God's past work and promises. And let's respond with bold prayers, asking for God to rise up. And because of Jesus, we know he will, if not in this life, in the one